The revolt of Judas Maccabeus. But Judas, also called Maccabeus, and those with him secretly infiltrated the villages and summoned their kinsmen. They called together those who had continued in the Jewish religion and took them as companions. So they gathered about 6,000 men. They invoked the Lord to look upon the people, who were trampled underfoot by all, to have compassion on the temple, which had been profaned by ungodly men, to have mercy on the city, which was being destroyed and was about to be leveled to the ground, and to hearken to the blood that cried out to him. They also invoked him to remember the lawless destruction of the sinless babies and the blasphemies committed against his name, and to show his hatred of evil. As soon as Maccabeus had his army in order, he was not to be withstood by the Gentiles, for the wrath of the Lord had turned to mercy. He came without notice to towns and villages and set them on fire. At opportune times he regained places and put to flight not a few of the enemy. He found the night the best time for such hostilities. So talk of his manliness spread everywhere. Nicanor attacks Judea. When Philip realized that Judas was making progress little by little and that he was advancing with more frequent efficiency, he wrote to Ptolemy, the governor of Coele-Syria and Phoenicia, for aid to the king's government. And Ptolemy quickly appointed Nicanor the son of Patroclus, the foremost of his friends. He sent him in command of no fewer than 20,000 Gentiles of all nations to get rid of all the people of Judea. He sent Gorgias with him, a general and a man experienced in the affairs of war. Nicanor determined to make up for the king the taxes due to the Romans 2,000 talents from the capture of the Jews. He immediately sent word to the cities by the sea, inviting them to buy Jewish slaves and promising to hand over 90 slaves for a talent, not expecting that the judgment of the Almighty was about to fall upon him. Now word came to Judas concerning Nicanor's impending attack, and when he told those with him about the arrival of the army, those who were cowardly and distrustful of God's justice ran off and removed themselves from that place. Others sold all their remaining property, and at the same time entreated the Lord to rescue those sold by the ungodly Nicanor before he even met them. They entreated him, not for their own sake, but for the sake of the covenants made with their fathers, and because they were called by his holy and magnificent name. But Maccabeus gathered those around him, 6,000 in number, and exhorted them neither to be panic-stricken by the enemy nor to fear the great multitude of Gentiles who were unjustly coming against them, but to contend bravely. He also exhorted them to keep before their eyes the lawless outrage committed against the holy place by the Gentiles, and the torture of the mock city, and still more the dissolution of their ancestral way of life. For they trust in arms and bold acts, he said, but we trust in Almighty God, who with only one nod is able to overthrow both those who come against us and the entire world. He also spoke to them of the times help came to their forefathers, how the 185,000 perished under Sennacherib, and how in the time when the battle took place in Babylonia against the Galatians, 8,000 in all entered the fray, along with 4,000 Macedonians. But when the Macedonians were perplexed, the 8,000 destroyed the 120,000 because of the help that came to them from heaven. Then they took many spoils. Judas' victories. With these words he gave them good courage and prepared them to die on behalf of their laws and their homeland. Then he divided his forces into 4 parts. He appointed his brothers, Simon and Joseph and Jonathan, each to command a division, putting 1,500 soldiers under each. In addition, he appointed Eleazar to read aloud from the holy book and gave the watchword, the help of God. Then he led the first division himself and joined battle with Nicanor. When the Almighty became their ally, they slew more than 9,000 of the enemy, and wounded and crippled most of Nicanor's army, and forced them all to flee. They seized the money of those who came to buy them as slaves. After they pursued them for some distance, they were compelled to return because of the hour, for they did not continue their pursuit because it was the day before the Sabbath. So when they had collected their arms and stripped the spoils from their enemy, they kept the Sabbath, greatly blessing and giving thanks to the Lord, who had brought them safely through the day and appointed it for them as a beginning of mercy. Then after the Sabbath they gave a portion of the spoils to those who were tortured and to the widows and orphans, and distributed the rest among themselves and their children. When they had done this, they made a common supplication and besought the merciful Lord to be reconciled at last with his servants. Moreover, of the forces on the side of Timothy and Bacchides, who contended against them, they killed more than 20,000 of them and became the masters of exceedingly high fortresses. They divided a great many spoils, giving shares equal to their own to those who had been tortured and to the orphans and widows, and also to the aged. After they collected the enemy's weapons, they organized them all carefully in convenient places, and carried the rest of the spoils to Jerusalem. They killed the commander of Timothy's forces, a most unholy man and one who had greatly troubled the Jews. While they were celebrating the victory in the city of their fathers, they burned those who had set fire to the temple gates, Callisthens and some others, who had fled into one small house, so they received a recompense worthy of their impiety. The thrice sinful Nicanor had brought the 1,000 merchants for the purchase of the Jews, but he was humbled with the help of the Lord by the opponents he regarded as of the least account. Thus, after he succeeded primarily in the destruction of his own army, he took off his glorious military apparel and made his way inland alone like a fugitive until he reached Antioch. There, he who had undertaken to establish taxes for the Romans by the capture of the people of Jerusalem proclaimed that the Jews had a defender, and therefore were invulnerable, because they followed the laws appointed beforehand by him. God punishes Antiochus. About that time, it happened that Antiochus returned in dishonor from the region of Persia. For he had entered the city called Persepolis and attempted to rob the temples and control the city. Therefore when the citizens rushed to the city's aid with arms, Antiochus and his men were routed, and it came about that Antiochus was put to flight by the citizens and made a shameful return home. Now while he was in Ecbatana, news came to him about what had happened to Nicanor and the forces of Timothy. Swollen with rage, he supposed that he would also vent upon the Jews the evil done to him by those who had banished him. Wherefore he commanded his charioteer to drive without stopping to complete the journey. But the judgment of heaven came upon him, for in his arrogance he said, "When I arrive there I will make Jerusalem a common burial place of the Jews." But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him with an incurable and unseen plague. For as soon as he stopped speaking, a deadly pain seized him in his inward parts, with sharp internal torments, and this very justly, for he had tortured the inward parts of others with many and unusual afflictions. Yet by no means did he cease from his haughtiness, but was even more filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews and giving orders to hasten the journey. So it came to pass that he fell out of his chariot as it rushed along, and the fall was so hard that it tortured every limb of his body. He who had just been thinking that he could command the waves of the sea because of his superhuman arrogance, and imagined he could weigh the high mountains in a balance, was brought down to earth and carried in a litter. Thus he conveyed plainly to all the manifest power of God. Accordingly, worms swarmed up from the ungodly man's body, and his flesh rotted away while he was still alive, anguishing and in pain. Because of his odor, the whole army was repulsed by his rottenness, and because of his intolerable smell no one was able to carry the man who a little while before thought he could touch the stars of heaven. Then he was broken down, and began to cease from much of his arrogance and to come to a recognition of the divine scourge, for he was bent over with pain at every moment. When he could no longer endure his own stench, he spoke these words, "It is right to be subject to God, and no mortal should think that he is equal with God." Then this disgusting man prayed to the Lord, who would no longer have mercy on him, saying that the holy city, which he had been hastening to level to the ground and make into a common burial place, he was now proclaiming to be free. Moreover, the Jews, whom he did not consider worthy of a burial place, but to be thrown out along with their children for the wild animals and the birds to eat, he would make them all equal to citizens of Athens. Furthermore, the holy temple, which he had plundered in times past, he would adorn with the finest offerings, and restore many times over all the holy vessels, and the taxes assigned to the sacrifices he would pay from his own revenues. In addition to this, he also would become a Jew and visit every inhabited place to proclaim the might of God. Notes from the previous page. 737-38 While condemning King Antiochus' actions, the youngest brother also hopes that he will eventually repent and confess that he alone is God. 8:1-7 The lowest point of the book has been reached, and now the people of Israel begin to revolt against the Gentiles under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus. 8:16 The revolt gains momentum and the early successes attract 6,000 Jews, who form an army in order to enter full-scale warfare against the Gentiles. 8:23 The outmanned army of Jews with its watchword is not unlike the army of the Emperor Constantine, who fought in the name of Christ to defeat a superior foe in the early 4th century. 8:26-27 Even in the heat of battle, keeping the Sabbath took precedence over all else. A final letter to the Jews. But when his sufferings did not cease at all, for the judgment of God came upon him justly, he was driven to despair over what had happened to him. Thus he wrote the Jews the letter recorded below, in the form of a supplication. It contained the following words: To the good Jewish citizens, Antiochus your king and general sends many greetings and good wishes for your health and welfare. If you and your children are strong and your interests are served, then I am glad. With my hope in heaven, I kindly remember your respect and goodwill. Now as I was returning home from the region of Persia, I was struck with a difficult illness and now consider it necessary to be concerned about the common safety of all. But I am not giving up hope for myself, for I have great hope of escaping from this illness. Nevertheless, I observed that even my father, when he led his army into the upper countries, appointed his successor, that if anything unexpected should arise or any unwelcome news should come, the people throughout the realm would not be troubled, for they would know to whom the government was left. In addition to this, I understand how the rulers, close at hand, and the neighbors of my kingdom, keep watching for opportunities and waiting to see how things will turn out. Thus I have appointed my son Antiochus to be king. Oftentimes when I hastened off to the upper provinces, I entrusted and commended him to most of you. So I have written to him what is written here. Therefore I urge you and request that you remember my acts of kindness for both the common and private good, and maintain your present goodwill toward me and my son. For I am persuaded that he, following my policy, will treat you kindly and considerately. So the murderer and blasphemer suffered very grievously, as he had treated others. For he died a miserable death in the mountains of a foreign land. Then Philip, who grew up with him, took his body home. But fearing the son of Antiochus, he went instead to Ptolemy Philometor in Egypt. Judas Maccabeus purifies the temple with the Lord leading them on. Maccabeus and those with him received back the temple and the city. They took down the altars fabricated in the marketplace by the foreigners, and also destroyed the sacred precincts. When they had purified the temple, they made another altar and, striking fire out of stones, they offered sacrifices the first in 2 years. They offered incense and lit lamps and set out the bread of the presence. When they had done this, they fell prostrate and besought the Lord so as never again to fall into such calamities, but if they should ever sin, they might be chastised by him with gentleness and not be handed over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. It happened on the anniversary of the same day the temple was profaned by the foreigners, that the purification of the temple took place, on the 25th day of the same month, which was Kislev. They celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing, in the manner of the Feast of Tabernacles, remembering how a short time before they had spent the feast living in mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, carrying ivy-wreathed wands, beautiful olive branches, and even palm branches, they offered hymns of praise to him who made possible the purifying of his own place. They decreed by a common edict and vote that the whole Jewish nation should celebrate these days every year. Such then was the end of Antiochus, called Epiphanes. The reign of Antiochus V begins now. We will tell what took place under Antiochus Eupator, the son of that ungodly man, and will set forth and encompass briefly the calamities of the wars. For this man inherited the kingdom and appointed a certain Lysias as chief governor of Coele-Syria and Phoenicia. Then Ptolemy, called Macron, led the way in protecting the rights of the Jews because of the wrongdoing that happened to them, and he attempted to maintain peaceful relations with them. For this reason he was accused before Eupator by the king's friends. He heard himself called a traitor at every turn because he abandoned Cyprus, entrusted to him by Philometor, and defected to Antiochus Epiphanes. Since he could not exercise his noble authority honorably, he took poison and ended his life. The Idumeans fall to Judas. When Gorgias became governor of the region, he maintained mercenary troops and attacked the Jews at every turn. At the same time, the Idumeans, in possession of vital strongholds, were harassing the Jews. They received fugitives from Jerusalem and endeavored to keep up the war. But Maccabeus and his men made supplication and implored God to be their ally, then rushed against the strongholds of the Idumeans. They attacked them aggressively, gained possession of the places, and drove back all who fought upon the wall. They slaughtered everyone they encountered, killing no fewer than 20,000. But at least 9,000 fled into two very strong towers, which were well equipped, containing everything necessary to withstand a siege. So Maccabeus left behind Simon, Joseph, and also Zacchaeus and those with him, a force sufficient to besiege them. Then he went to more urgent places. But those around Simon, who were money lovers, were bribed by some of those in the towers. When they had received 70,000 drachmas, they allowed some of them to slip away. When news of what happened reached Maccabeus, he gathered the leaders of the people and accused them of selling their brothers for money by releasing their enemies to fight against them. Then he killed these men who had become traitors and immediately seized the two towers. Faring well at arms in everything he undertook, he destroyed more than 20,000 in the two fortresses. Notes from the previous page. 9:8 There is a song of peace in Isaiah wherein no one but the Lord can weigh the high mountains, Isaiah 40:12, but Antiochus is so absorbed in superhuman arrogance he is seen as making himself equal to God, see 9:12. 9:9 Note that Herod was inflicted with a similar condition, Acts 12:23. 9:11-18 Antiochus' repentance is a classic case of too little too late. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, Hebrews 10:31. 10:5 The 25th of Kislev on the Hebrew calendar corresponds with December 25, bringing to mind the coming of the Son of God in the flesh for the purification of mankind. 10:6 The Feast of Tabernacles is a September Jewish feast, mentioned in Leviticus 23:43 as the Feast of Booths, when the Jews would live in booths constructed out of palm branches. 10:7 The scene is reminiscent of Palm Sunday, John 12:13. 10:10 Antiochus Eupator inherits the kingdom in 925. He is a young boy who reigns for only 2 years before being murdered, see 14:1, 2, 1 Maccabees 7:34. Maccabeus victorious over Timothy. Now Timothy, who had been defeated previously by the Jews, gathered a very massive and powerful force of mercenaries and assembled cavalry from Asia in no small number. Then he arrived as though he would take Judea captive. As he drew near, Maccabeus and his men made supplication to God as they sprinkled earth on their heads and girded their loins with sackcloth. They fell prostrate before the foot of the altar and implored him to be merciful to them and to be an enemy to their enemies and an adversary to their adversaries, as the law plainly shows. Then arising from prayer, they took up their weapons and advanced a considerable distance from the city. When they came near the enemy, they were by themselves. But as dawn was breaking, the armies attacked one another. The one had the guarantee of prosperity and victory, with their virtue and the Lord as their place of refuge, but the other depended on rage as their leader in the fight. When the battle was strongly contested, there appeared to the enemy from heaven 5 majestic men on horses with golden bridles, and they were leading the Jews. They took Maccabeus between them and shielded him with their own armor. They kept him from being wounded and cast arrows and thunderbolts on the enemy. Wherefore, confused with blindness and full of disorder, they were cut to pieces. 20,500 were slaughtered along with 600 cavalry. Timothy himself fled to a stronghold called Gazara, especially well garrisoned, where Chares was commander. Maccabeus and his men eagerly besieged the stronghold for 4 days, but the men within it trusted in the security of the place. So they kept blaspheming beyond measure and uttering disgusting words. Now when the 5th day dawned, 20 young men in the army of Maccabeus burned with anger because of the blasphemies. So they bravely attacked the wall and with savage fury struck down everyone they encountered. Others likewise went up during the distraction against those inside and burned down the towers. They kindled fires and burned the blasphemers alive. Others broke through the gates, let in the rest of the force, and took control of the city. They killed Timothy, who was hiding in a well, and his brother Chares and Apollophanes. When they had done this, they blessed the Lord with hymns and praises, thanking him who shows great kindness to Israel and gives them victory. The defeat of Lysias shortly afterward, Lysias, who was the king's guardian and kinsman and in charge of the government, was greatly upset at what had happened, and gathered about 80,000 infantry and all his cavalry to come against the Jews. He purposed to make the city a home for Greeks, to levy taxes on the temple, as he did on the sacred places of the other nations, and to put the high priesthood up for sale every year. He took no account at all of God's power, but was elated with his countless thousands of infantry and his thousands of cavalry, plus his 80 elephants. Thus he entered Judea and drew near Bethzur, a fortified place about 20 miles from Jerusalem, and besieged it. When Maccabeus and his men heard of this, that Lysias was besieging the strongholds, they and all the people begged the Lord with lamentations and tears to send a good angel to save Israel. Maccabeus himself was the first to bear arms, and he pleaded with the others to join with him in risking their lives to go help their brothers. Then they eagerly set out together. But in that place, while they were still near Jerusalem, a horseman appeared before them, clothed in white and brandishing a full armor of gold. Then together they all blessed the merciful God and were strengthened in heart, ready to bring damage not only on humans but on the most savage of beasts or walls of iron. Because the Lord had mercy on them, they advanced with their weapons, having with them their ally from heaven. They hurled themselves against the enemy like lions and overthrew 11,000 of them, as well as 1,600 cavalry, and forced all of them to flee. Most of them escaped, wounded and naked, and Lysias himself escaped by a disgraceful flight. A peace accord with the Jews, but as Lysias was not lacking in intelligence, he discussed the loss that had happened to him. He realized the Hebrews were unconquerable, because the Almighty God was their ally. So he sent a message and persuaded them to settle everything on just terms. Moreover, perhaps he could also persuade the king and compel him to become their friend. Then Maccabeus agreed to everything Lysias urged, since he was concerned about what was best for all. For whatever Maccabeus gave to Lysias in writing concerning the Jews, the king granted. 4 letters were written to the Jews from Lysias, encompassing the following: Lysias to the people of the Jews, greetings. John and Absalom, who were sent by you, have given us your signed communication and asked about the matters addressed in it. Accordingly, I reported to the king whatever was necessary to bring him, and he granted whatever was possible. If you will keep your goodwill toward the government, I will try in the future to promote your welfare. So in behalf of these things and their details, I have ordered that these men and my representatives confer with you. Farewell. The 148th year, the 24th of Dioscorinthius. Now the king's letters contain the following: King Antiochus to Lysias his brother, greetings. Since our father has departed to the gods, we desire the subjects of the kingdom be undisturbed in caring for their own affairs. We understand the Jews do not approve of our father's change to Greek customs, but choose their own way of life and ask that their customs be granted them. Since therefore we prefer for this nation to be free from disturbance, our decision is for their temple to be returned to them and for them to live according to the customs of their forefathers. Therefore, you will do well to send word to them and give them assurances of friendship, so they may know our policy. Be in good spirits, and continue gladly to help them in their own affairs. The king's letter to the nation was as follows: King Antiochus to the Jewish Senate and the rest of the Jews, greetings. If you are healthy, this would be as we desire. We are also in good health. Menelaus has told us you wish to return home and attend to your own affairs. Therefore, those who return home by the 30th of Xanthicus will have our pledge of friendship, with freedom from fear, for the Jews to enjoy their own food and laws as before, and none of them shall be troubled in any way for things done in ignorance. I have also sent Menelaus to encourage you. Farewell. The 148th year, the 15th of Xanthicus. The Romans also sent them a letter, which read as follows: Quintus Memmius and Titus Mennius, legates of the Romans, to the people of the Jews, greetings. We also approve of those things concerning which Lysias the kinsman of the king has granted you. But the matters he decided to report to the king, as soon as you have considered these things, send someone promptly that we may explain what is suitable for you, for we are on our way to Antioch. For this reason make haste and send someone to let us know your intentions. Farewell. The 148th year, the 15th of Xanthicus. Notes from the previous page. 1029 See Revelations 9:17. 1038 The Jews begin, 1016, and end their task in prayer. 11:3 It was a pagan Greek practice to sell the high priesthood annually in order to raise money for the government. 11:8 See 325. 11:16 The name of Judas Maccabeus is conspicuous in its absence from these letters, an obvious snub by Lysias. 11:21 December, 164 BC. Judas prevails in Joppa and Jamnia. When these agreements had been made, Lysias returned to the king, and the Jews went back to their farming. But some of the governors of various locales, Timothy and Apollonius son of Genneus, as well as Hieronymus and Demophon, and in addition Nicanor the commander of the Cyprians, would not allow the Jews to enjoy tranquility and live in peace. Then the people of Joppa did so great an ungodly deed as this: they invited the Jews who lived among them, together with their wives and children, to embark on ships equipped for sea, as though they harbored no ill will toward them. Now this was done by the common vote of the city. But when the Jews welcomed this, wishing to live in peace and suspecting nothing, the men of Joppa took them out to sea and drowned at least 200 of them. When Judas learned of the cruelty visited on his countrymen, he summoned his men. So when he had called upon God, the righteous judge, he attacked the murderers of his brothers. He set the harbor on fire by night, burned the ships, and put to the sword those who fled there. But since the gates of the city were closed, he departed, intending to come again and root out the whole community of Joppa. However, when he learned that the people in Jamnia intended to wipe out the Jews who were living among them in the same way, he attacked the Jamnian people by night and set the harbor and the fleet on fire. Therefore, the glow of the light was visible as far as Jerusalem, 30 miles away. Defeat of the nomads. When they had gone about a mile from there on their march against Timothy, Arabs attacked him with no less than 5,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. After a strongly contested battle, Judas and his men, with God's help, were successful. The defeated nomads pleaded with Judas to grant them pledges of friendship. They promised to give him livestock and to benefit them in other ways. So Judas, supposing they could indeed be useful in varied ways, agreed to make peace with them. Then after he accepted their pledges, they returned to their tents. He also attacked a certain town named Caspin, strongly fortified with earthworks and walls, and inhabited by a mixed population of Gentiles. Those within it trusted in the security of the walls and their supply of provisions. They behaved very contemptuously toward Judas and his men, insulting them and even blaspheming and saying unlawful things. But Judas and his men called upon the great Lord of the world, who overthrew Jericho without battering rams or engines of war in the times of Joshua. Then Judas and his men assaulted the walls. They overpowered the city by the will of God and inflicted such indescribable slaughter that the adjoining lake, a quarter of a mile wide, seemed to be filled with blood. Victory over Timothy's garrison. From there, they went 95 miles and continued on to Charax, to the Jews who were called Tobiani. They did not overtake Timothy in that region, for by then he had departed from there without accomplishing anything, but in one place Timothy left a very strong garrison. Dositheus and Sosipater, who were commanders under Maccabeus, marched out and crushed those men Timothy left in the stronghold, over 10,000 soldiers. But Maccabeus organized his army in divisions, setting men in command of the divisions, and hastened after Timothy, who had with him 120,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry. When Timothy learned of the approach of Judas, he sent the women and the children ahead with the baggage to a place called Carnaim, for that place was hard to attack and difficult to access because of the narrowness of all its places. But when Judas' first division appeared, alarm and fear came over the enemy at the manifestation to them of him who sees all things. They ran off in flight, rushing headlong in every direction, so as to be often hurt by their own men and stabbed by the points of their own swords. Judas pursued them with great vigor, piercing the sinful men with the sword and killing as many as 30,000 of them. Timothy himself fell into the hands of Dositheus and Sosipater and their soldiers. With great trickery he pleaded with them to let him go safely, because he held the parents of most of them and some of their brothers, to whom no regard would be shown. So when with many words he had confirmed his solemn promise to restore them unharmed, they released him for the sake of rescuing their brothers. Other campaigns. Then Judas marched against Carnaim and the temple of Atargatis, and destroyed 25,000 people. After the rout and slaughter of these, he also marched on Ephron, a fortified town where Lysias lived with countless people of all nations. Strong young men were set as guards before the walls and fought mightily. Many provisions of war engines and missiles were stored there. But the Jews called upon the Lord, who with power crushes the strength of his enemies. Thus they took possession of the city and killed as many as 25,000 of those within it. Moving away from Ephron, they hurried on to Scythopolis, 75 miles from Jerusalem. But when the Jews who lived there testified to the goodwill the people of Scythopolis had shown them and their civilized treatment of them in times of trouble, they thanked them and encouraged them also to be favorable to the Jewish race in the future. Then Judas and his men arrived at Jerusalem, the Feast of Weeks being close at hand. After this feast, also called Pentecost, they marched against Gorgias, the governor of Idumea. He came out against them with 3,000 infantry and 400 cavalry. After they engaged in battle, it happened that a few of the Jews were killed. But a certain Dositheus, one of Biashenor's men, a man on horseback and a strong man, grabbed hold of Gorgias. He took hold of his cloak and was dragging him off by sheer strength. He intended to take the accursed man alive, but one of the Thracian cavalry chased him down and severed his arm. So Gorgias fled to Marissa. Now Esdras and his men had been fighting for a long while and were tired. So Judas called on the Lord to show himself as their ally and leader in battle. They began to sound the battle cry in the language of their forefathers and sang hymns. Then he charged against the troops of Gorgias when they least expected it, and set them to flight. Prayers for the fallen. Then Judas retrieved his army and entered the city of Adullam. As the 7th day was dawning, they purified themselves according to custom and spent the Sabbath there. The following day, as was now necessary, Judas and his men left to gather up the bodies of those killed in battle, to bring them back to rest with their kindred in the tombs of their forefathers. But under the tunics of each of the dead, they uncovered sacred tokens of the Jamnian idols, which the Jews are forbidden by law to wear. So the reason these men died in battle became clear to everyone. Thus they all blessed the ways of the Lord, the righteous judge, who reveals the hidden things. They turned to supplication and prayed that the sin they had committed might be completely blotted out. The noble Judas exhorted his people to guard themselves from sin, for with their own eyes they had seen what happened to those who died in battle because of their sin. He then took up an offering from his soldiers amounting to 2,000 silver drachmas, and sent it to Jerusalem to present as a sin offering. In doing so he acted properly and with honor, taking note of the resurrection. For if he were not looking for the resurrection of those fallen, it would have been utterly foolish to pray for the departed. But since he was looking to the reward of splendor laid up for those who repose in godliness, it was a holy and godly purpose. Thus he made atonement for the fallen, so as to set them free from their transgression. Notes from the previous page. 12:2 Timothy, c. 8:30, 33. 12:8 Jamnia is just south of Joppa. 12:15 see Joshua 6:1, 21. 12:22 A manifestation of God, who sees all things. 12:31 This is a wheat harvest feast celebrated 7 weeks after Passover, when men were required to be present in Jerusalem. 12:32 Pentecost is used here as another name for the Feast of Weeks. 12:40 These tokens are pagan charms that are idolatrous to the Jews. The death of Menelaus in the 149th year. Judas and his men got word that Antiochus Eupator was marching against Judea with a huge army, and with him his guardian, Lysias, who was in charge of the government. Each of them had a Greek army of 110,000 infantry, 5,300 horsemen, 22 elephants, and 300 chariots armed with scythes. Menelaus also joined forces with them. It was a great irony that he encouraged Antiochus, not for the preservation of his homeland, but for his expectation to be established in authority. But the King of Kings aroused anger in Antiochus against this sinful man. So when Lysias pointed out that this man was the cause of all the trouble, he commanded them to take him to Beroea, to put him to death as was the custom there. For there is a tower in that place, 50 cubits high and filled with ashes. It also has a contrivance continuing around it on all sides that inclines steeply into the ashes. There they all shove anyone guilty of sacrilege or who has done excessive evils to their destruction. Thus it happened that Menelaus the lawbreaker died by such a destiny. He was even deprived of a burial in the ground. 8 Now this was altogether just, for since he committed many sins against the sacred altar, whose fire and ashes were holy, he should get death for himself in ashes. The Jews prevail near Modin. The king was coming with barbarous arrogance to face the Jews with things far worse than anything done by his father. 10 But when Judas learned of this, he charged the people to call upon the Lord day and night, asking him to help them now as he had formerly, for they were about to be deprived of their law, their homeland, and their temple. They prayed he would not allow the people who had just begun a new life to fall into the hands of the blaspheming Gentiles. After they all made the same petition together and constantly implored the merciful Lord with weeping, fasting, and prostrations for 3 days, Judas encouraged them and commanded them to stand firm. Then he consulted privately with the elders and determined to march out, to let the matter be decided by the help of God before the king's army could enter Judea and take possession of the city. So, committing the results to the Creator of all and urging those with him to fight nobly to the death for the laws, the temple, the city, the country, and the commonwealth, he positioned his army near Modin. After he gave his men the watchword, God's victory, and chose his best young men, he besieged the royal palace by night, killing as many as 2,000 men in the camp. He also slew the leading elephant and its rider. As a result, they filled the camp with terror and disorder and departed victoriously. This all happened by daybreak, because the protection of the Lord was with him. Antiochus V makes peace with the Jews. Thus the king tasted the courage of the Jews and plotted a strategy against their positions. He marched against Bethzur, a stronghold of the Jews, but was turned back. He attacked again, but was beaten. Judas then sent supplies to the men inside the fortress. But Rhodocus, a man from the Jewish army, tipped off the enemy with secret information. Thus he was sought after, caught, and imprisoned. The king spoke a second time with the people in Bethzur, gave assurances, received their pledges, and departed. He then attacked Judas and his forces, but was vanquished. He then learned that Philip, whom he had left in charge of the government in Antioch, had lost his sanity. He was disheartened and summoned the Jews, and yielded and gave an oath to honor all their rights. Thus he settled with them and offered sacrifice, respected the temple, and treated the place humanely. He welcomed Maccabeus, and Hegemonides was left as governor from Ptolemy to Gerar. Then he went to Ptolemy, but the people of Ptolemy were indignant over the treaty with the Jews. In fact, they were so enraged they sought to annul its provisions. But Lysias took the public stage and defended the treaty as best he could. He did persuade them, and gaining their goodwill, he returned to Antioch. This is the outcome of the king's strategy and settlement. Alcimus accuses Judas. After 3 years' time, word reached Judas and his soldiers that Demetrius, the son of Seleucus, had killed Antiochus and Lysias his guardian, then had sailed into the harbor of Tripolis with a powerful army and fleet and taken possession of the country. Now there was a certain Alcimus, formerly a high priest, who had willfully defiled himself in the times of social and political disturbance. He realized there was no way for him to live in safety or to approach the holy altar ever again. So he went to King Demetrius sometime in the 151st year and presented him a crown of gold and a palm branch, as well as some of the customary olive branches from the temple. During that day he remained peaceful. But he seized an opportunity in his own stupidity when he was invited by Demetrius to a session of the council and was questioned about the disposition and intentions of the Jews. Thus he said to the council, "Those of the Jews who are called Hasidians, whose leader is Judas Maccabeus, are maintaining war and stirring up rebellion, and will not allow the kingdom to attain stability. Wherefore I have set aside my paternal glory, meaning my high priesthood, and now have come here. I came here first out of my honest concern for the well-being of the king, and second out of consideration for my own fellow citizens, for through the rashness of those just mentioned, our entire nation is suffering misfortune. 9. Because you, O king, are acquainted with the details of these things, please take care of our country and our hard-pressed people with the gracious love for mankind that you have for everyone. For as long as Judas is alive, it will be impossible for the government to experience peace." Nicanor sent to kill Judas. After he said this, the rest of the king's friends who bore malice against Judas aroused even greater anger in Demetrius. Immediately he chose Nicanor, the commander of a squadron of elephants, appointing him governor of Judea. He sent him off with the charge to kill Judas, scatter his soldiers, and establish Alcimus as high priest of the great temple. The Gentiles who had fled before Judas throughout Judea joined Nicanor, for they thought the setbacks and calamities of the Jews would bring prosperity to themselves. The Jews got word of Nicanor's coming and the assault of the Gentiles. So they sprinkled their heads with earth and prayed to him who establishes his people forever, and always helps his own inheritance by making himself present. At the command of Judas their leader, they immediately moved the army from there and met the enemy in battle at a village called Dessau. Simon, the brother of Judas, had encountered Nicanor in battle, but was halted because of the unexpected silence of those adversaries. Notes from the previous page. 1242. This is a clear statement that the righteous Jews prayed for the departed so that the sin they had committed might be blotted out. 12:43-44. It is hope in the resurrection of the departed that forms the basis for prayers for them. In Christ all are alive. The power of these verses clearly indicates the depth of belief the Jews had in both the resurrection and the power of prayer for those gone before us to their rest. 1245. Judas Maccabeus leads the Jews in praying for the release of their compatriots who had sinned. 13:4. The King of Kings is the eternal Son and Word of God, see Revelations 19:13, 16. 13:12. To pray in a prostrate position was a sign of great need to be freed from acts of sacrilege, see 3:15, 10:4. The fact that they made prostrations for 3 days and then arose reminds us of the third-day resurrection of Jesus Christ. 14:1. This is about the year 161 BC. The invaders kill both Antiochus and Lysias, see 1 Maccabees. 7:2, 4. 14:4. By offering the crown of gold, Alcimus concedes that Demetrius is the new king. And the palm branch is an emblem of his victory. Our Lord is offered palm branches in Jerusalem, emblematic of his kingship, John 12:13. 14:6-10. The parallels between Alcimus and Judas Iscariot are noteworthy. Alcimus attempts to destroy Judas Maccabeus as Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus. A short-lived alliance nevertheless, when Nicanor heard of the bravery of Judas and his men and their courage in battle for their country, he pulled back from deciding the matter by bloodshed. So he sent forth Posidonius, Theodotus, and Mattathias to offer and receive pledges of friendship. After an extensive investigation of the terms, the leader communicated the terms to the people, and it appeared they were of one mind, and they agreed to the treaty. So they set aside a day to meet privately. From each army a chariot came forward, and seats of honor were set in place. Judas appointed battle-ready men at strategic places lest the enemy attempt sudden trickery, but the consultation was held in a fitting way. Nicanor remained in Jerusalem and did nothing improper, but he dismissed the crowd of people that had gathered. He also kept Judas in his presence continually, for he was heartily attached to the man. He encouraged him to marry and have children. Thus Judas got married, settled down, and lived a normal life. A rekindled enmity when Alcimus became aware of their goodwill for each other, he took the treaty that was made and went to King Demetrius. He told him Nicanor was disloyal to the government, since he had appointed Judas, the plotter against the kingdom, to be his successor. The king became enraged. Provoked by the false accusations of that depraved man, he wrote to Nicanor that he was most displeased with the treaty and ordered him to send Maccabeus as a prisoner to Antioch at once. When this message reached Nicanor, he was upset and very grieved that he had to break the agreement when the man had not done wrong. But since he could not act in opposition to the king, he watched for a strategic opportunity to carry out the command. Maccabeus noticed that Nicanor was becoming more harsh in his treatment of him and more rude when they met than was customary. Judas decided Nicanor's sour behavior was not at all propitious, so he gathered up a good number of his men and hid from him. When Nicanor realized he had been boldly outmaneuvered by the man, he went to the great and holy temple and found the priests offering the customary sacrifices. He commanded them to hand him over. They declared under oath they did not know the whereabouts of the man he sought. So Nicanor stretched out his right hand toward the temple and swore this oath: "If you will not hand over Judas to me as a prisoner, I will raze this shrine of God to the ground, destroy the altar, and erect at this place a splendid temple to Dionysus." After he said this, he departed. Then the priests reached out their hands to heaven, calling upon the everlasting defender of our nation, saying, "O Lord of all, while you have need of nothing, you were pleased to have a temple for your dwelling in our midst. Now then, O Holy One, O Lord of all holiness, preserve forever undefiled this house so recently purified." Rhazes the elder dies. Rhazes was one of the elders of Jerusalem and was denounced before Nicanor as a man who loved his fellow citizens, a man held in high esteem and called a father of the Jews because of his goodwill. For in past times when there was isolation from the Gentiles, he was brought to judgment for practicing the Jewish religion. But with all zeal he risked his life, body, and soul, for his religion. Nicanor wished to make obvious his ill will for the Jews. So he sent more than 500 soldiers to arrest Rhazes, for he thought that by arresting him he would produce calamity among the Jews. Thus when the soldiers were about to capture the tower and were forcing open the door of the courtyard, they commanded that the doors be set on fire. When Rhazes was surrounded, he fell upon his own sword, for he preferred to die bravely rather than fall into the hands of sinners and suffer outrages unworthy of his own noble birth. However, in the tension of the confrontation, he did not fall with exactness on his sword. As the crowd rushed through the doors, he took courage and jumped up on the wall, bravely throwing himself down into the throng. But as people quickly stepped back, there was an open space, and he landed in the midst of the empty area. He was still alive. In a blaze of anger, he stood up, and though his blood gushed like a spring and his injuries were severe, he darted through the crowd. He climbed up on a steep rock, and with his blood completely drained out of him, he tore out his intestines, took them in both hands and threw them at the crowd as he called on the Lord of life and spirit to return them to him again. Such was the manner of his death. Nicanor's failed plan. When Nicanor learned that Judas and his men were in the province of Samaria, he decided to attack them in utter safety on their day of rest. But the Jews who were forced to accompany him said, "By no means should you so cruelly and barbarously bring destruction. Show respect for the Sabbath day, which he who sees all things has honored with holiness above other days." Then the thrice sinful man asked if there were a Lord in heaven who ordered the keeping of the Sabbath day. When they declared, "It is the living Lord himself, the ruler in heaven, who commanded the keeping of the seventh day," he responded, "I am a ruler on earth. I command you to take up your weapons and complete the king's business." Nevertheless, he was unsuccessful in carrying out his heinous plan. Judas Maccabeus mobilizes his men in his utter vanity and arrogance. Nicanor decided to put up a public monument of victory over Judas and his army. But Maccabeus never ceased to trust the Lord and fully hoped that he would help him. So he encouraged his men to have no fear of any attack from the Gentiles, but to bear in mind how help had come to them from heaven in times past. Now they should anticipate the victory the Almighty would give to them. 9. He also exhorted them out of the law and the prophets, calling to mind the battles they had won, making them more eager to fight. Then after he revived their courage, he gave his commands and at the same time emphasized the Gentiles' faithlessness and their failure to keep their oaths. So he issued each of them armor, not so much of the surety of shields and spears as with the encouragement of courageous speech. Then he inspired them all by telling about a dream, a kind of vision, worthy of believing. The vision he saw was this: Onias, who had been high priest, a true gentleman of modest and noble manner, one well spoken and from childhood formed in all that pertains to virtue, was praying with hands outstretched for the whole nation of the Jews. Then in the same manner another man appeared, distinguished by his grey hair and glory, and having about him a certain astonishing and majestic preeminence. Onias then spoke, saying, "This is Jeremiah, the prophet of God, a man who loves his brothers and prays fervently for the people and the holy city." Stretching forth his right hand, Jeremiah gave a sword of gold to Judas, and as he presented it to him, he addressed him as follows: "Take this sacred sword, a gift from God, by which you will strike down your enemies." Encouraged by Judas' words, a man so good and able in stirring up virtue and courage in the souls of young men, they determined not to plan out a campaign. Instead they would wage war bravely, at once, deciding the matter with hand-to-hand combat with all manliness, because the city, the sanctuary, and the temple were at risk. Their main concern was not first for wives and children, or even for brothers and relatives, their greatest fear was for the consecrated temple. As for those who remained in the city, they were distressed and worried about the conflict in the open country. Notes from the previous page. 14:15 Sprinkling earth on the head is a sign of humility and a recognition of God the Creator, see Genesis 3:19 and also Joshua 7:6. 14:33 Since the Jews had recent memory of the cult of Dionysus, this oath would have had profound impact, see 6:7. 14:35-36 This petition reflects the traditional patterns of Jewish liturgical prayer. 15:1 Nicanor was aware the Jews would not fight on the Sabbath. 15:2 These Jews were conscripted into Nicanor's army and wished to keep the Sabbath. See Exodus 20:8, 11. 15:12 Onias is the high priest recorded in 3:1, 4:1. 15:14 The Jews believed departed saints like Jeremiah were alive before the general resurrection. This is clearly revealed in the New Testament when Moses and Elijah appear with Christ on Mount Tabor, Matthew 17:1, 4. Nicanor's demise. Everyone was now living in suspense over the outcome of the war. The enemy was nearby, their army was prepared for battle. And their elephants were strategically positioned, and the cavalry was deployed on the flanks. Maccabeus noted carefully the great masses before him, the variety of their armaments, and the savageness of the elephants. So he reached out his hands toward heaven and called on the Lord, the wonder-worker, for he knew it is not by weapons alone, but by the Lord's decision that victory is won by those worthy of it. Thus he cried out to him in the following manner, O Lord, in the time of Hezekiah the king of Judea, you sent your angel, and he killed as many as 185,000 in the camp of Sennacherib. So now, O ruler of the heavens, send us a noble angel to go before us spreading fear and trembling. By the strength of your arm, may those who speak blasphemy as they come against your holy ones be struck down. With these words he completed his prayer. Nicanor and his men marched ahead with trumpets and battle songs, but Judas and his men joined the enemy in battle with invocations and prayers. They fought with their hands and prayed to God in their hearts, and struck down at least 35,000 men. So they were deeply gladdened by God's visitation. When the battle was ended and they were marching home with joy, they recognized Nicanor, in full armor, lying dead. With tumultuous shouts, they blessed the Lord in the language of their fathers. Then Judas, who was in body and soul ever the chief defender of his fellow citizens and who from youth maintained goodwill toward his countrymen, commanded them to sever Nicanor's head and arm and take them back to Jerusalem. When he arrived there, he called his countrymen together and stationed the priests before the altar. Then he sent for those in the citadel. Before them, he displayed the head of the defiled Nicanor and that slanderous man's hand, which he had boastfully stretched out against the holy house of the Almighty. He cut out the tongue of the godless Nicanor and announced he would feed it to the birds bit by bit, and hang up the rewards of his folly opposite the sanctuary. Then everyone lifted their eyes to heaven and blessed the Lord who visited them, saying, Blessed is he who kept his own place undefiled. Judas then fastened Nicanor's head to the wall of the citadel, a visible symbol to all present of the Lord's help. So they all decreed by public vote never to allow this day to be unobserved, but to celebrate it on the 13th day of the 12th month, called Adar in the Syrian language the day before Mordecai's day. The end. This is the way things turned out for Nicanor. So from that time on the city has been controlled by the Hebrews. Thus I will end my story here. If I have written well and made my point in the narrative, this is what I myself desired. But if it was done poorly and is just average, this is the best I could do. For as it is disagreeable to drink wine only or water only, whereas wine mingled with water is pleasing and delightful and brings greater joy, so also the written style of the account delights the ears of those who read it. This then shall be the end. Notes from this page. 1518 The Jews' main concern is to protect the temple, see 1433. 1522 see Fourth Kingdoms 1935. 1526 One of the prayers the Jews may have used in battle is Psalm 68, the verses of which the Orthodox Church uses to begin Paschal Matins, Liturgy, and Vespers. They announce Christ's defeat of death and the devil. 1530 This is Nicanor's right arm, which he used to point at the temple sanctuary and threaten to level the altar and erect a shrine to Dionysus, see 1433, 1532. 1539 Delights the ears indicates this work was meant to be read aloud.